Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Transportation Management Configuration Deep Dive, Freight Reconciliation. My name is Peggy, and I'll be your moderator today. We're broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. This session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. By participating in this session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions during today's presentation, and there will be time at the end for further questions. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Nicole Gump, Senior Program Manager. Nicole, over to you.
Thanks, Peggy, and welcome everyone to our final Tech Talk in 2020 in our Dynamics 365 for Supply Chain Management series. If you have missed any of the previous sessions in this series, you can always go back and view the recordings on the Community Dynamics page where you registered for this event. So as Peggy introduced, our topic today is going to be a configuration deep dive on the freight reconciliation functionality within our transportation management module. So let's review our agenda. So we will go through the core configurations that are required when using the freight reconciliation features. We will discuss the functionality as it pertains to the business processes. And then we will go through some tips for setting up the different configuration forms that we need. And I will also be going into the system for a demo and to discuss some of the configurations further toward the end of the presentation. So let's start with the core configurations. So the first configurations that we need are in our transportation management module level parameters. When you open that parameter form, there are a couple of things that need to be set for freight reconciliation. The first one is that the feature actually just needs to be enabled. So there's just a Boolean parameter that needs to be turned on if you're going to use the freight reconciliation functionality in transportation management. This second set of parameters is a little bit more involved. You'll find those under the vendor invoice tab on the parameter form, and those settings allow you to determine how automated or how manual you want the vendor invoice posting process to be at the end of the reconciliation process. So I'll discuss those in a bit more detail when we get into the system and look at these forms. So after we have those parameters set, we have got a set of configurations that you'll find under the setup section in the transportation management module. And the first one of those is the reconciliation reasons. So these are essentially reason codes that allow us to define the debit and credit accounts that are used to reconcile any carrier invoice amount that does not match our estimated freight bill amount. Then we have got billing groups, and our billing groups are user defined and they allow us to specify essentially what the billing categories are, such as freight and fuel and dock fees and detention, any of those different categories that you might find on your carrier invoice. Then we have got freight bill types and freight bill type assignments. So the freight bill type allows you to define which fields are required to match between the freight bill, the estimate, and the carrier invoice actual amount during the auto match and pay or auto reconciliation process. And then the freight bill type assignment allows you to define the carrier association for those different freight bill types. So which types are used by which carriers. And that helps when the carrier invoices are put into the system and then the reconciliation process is run. And then finally, we've got our audit master, and the audit master is really at the heart of the auto reconciliation process, and it allows you to define the tolerances for overages and underages, and also any exceptions that may apply to maybe certain billing groups versus the general tolerances. So we will discuss each of those in a little bit more detail when we talk about the tips for setting them up, as well as I will show them all in our demo system with the Contoso data as well. So before we get there, let's just talk a little bit about the kind of functionality in the business process that freight reconciliation applies to. So I've got this very high level graphic here that shows on the right-hand side, we have a freight bill. That is the record that is generated in Dynamics 365 for supply chain management when you ship confirm a load. So that is the trigger that creates a freight bill record in the system. The other thing that is happening that is important to this process is that at that same trigger time when you ship confirm a load, the estimated freight charge is apportioned back to the source order line. So to your sales order lines, if we're talking about sales orders. So those two things are important at that point in time. So we ship confirm, we get the freight charge apportioned back to our order, and that is through the miscellaneous charge setup. And then we also get this freight bill record that is generated for that estimated charge. And then once we have actually shipped out our load, our carrier has picked it up, they have delivered it. At some point in the future, you'll see here on the right-hand side, we're going to have a carrier invoice with our actual freight charges. So what it actually costs them to deliver that freight for us. So the carrier invoice can be imported into the system via EDI if you have want to make that a very automatic process. But it can also be entered manually, or it can be entered manually in more of a, we'll call it semi-automated way by using the freight bill as a basis for entering the carrier invoice record in the system. So if your carriers are not EDI capable, if they send you invoices in the mail or via email, and you have someone who is manually entering them, there are still a couple of ways that they can get into the system. And I'll review that in my demo later. But so at this point in time, we've got a freight bill that was generated when we shipped. We have a carrier invoice that we have received from the carrier after they have actually delivered the freight. And now in the middle, we've got this reconciliation, a review process that we need to do to match up those two amounts. And some of the other benefits for performing the freight reconciliation is just to give you visibility to that full freight payment lifecycle. Also allows you to do some carrier performance evaluation. If your estimates are consistently, very far off from the carrier invoices, then perhaps you have something to review there on the carrier performance. And then also, if you automate the reconciliation process, then you're potentially reducing any billing errors and also any manual handling and processing costs that you may have by someone having to manually review every freight bill against the carrier invoices that come in. So I have the same graphic up, but this time I have overlaid the configurations that we spoke about earlier, our core configurations for freight reconciliation. So this is kind of where they come into play in the process. So when our freight bill is generated, we've got our billing groups on our freight bill, and we've got our freight bill type that is going to be populated on that freight bill. On the carrier invoice, it's using the freight bill type assignment to know the freight bill type to apply to the carrier invoice lines. And then in our reconciliation process, we've got those reconciliation reason codes that allow us to specify those accounts, again, that are debited and credited for the variances between the two records. And then our audit master there in the reconciliation process is what allows us to automate the posting of any of those variances with the reason codes and within the tolerances that we define in the audit master. So that's how all the configurations are kind of related to the process. So now I want to go over each of those configurations again, but just kind of some tips for setting them up. So the first one we have are the billing groups. And again, those are just user-defined categories in the system. And there's a pretty basic setup. It's a billing group ID and a name or a description for the group. But our tip here is to configure those, based on your carrier billing. So, if your carrier invoices have a certain set of categories defined for the charges, then, start with that list and define those in Dynamics 365 for your billing groups. And then on the freight bill types, this is where you want to set the requirements for matching. So there is a field in the freight bill type detail setup that says, is it required for matching? And you can leave it at no, which would essentially mean that even though the field is specified in the setup, it's essentially optional for the matching process. But if you do set it to yes, then both records, our freight bill and our carrier invoice, have to have that defined field populated and matching in order for the auto reconciliation to even consider it. If one of those fields is blank on one of the records or they don't match, it will be kicked out of the auto reconciliation process and someone will have to manually reconcile that freight bill and invoice. Then when we talk about the assignments of the freight bill type, here is where you're associating the carriers. There is also a site and warehouse field on this freight bill type assignment form. Our tip is to leave those blank. That way your assignment for the carrier applies across your distribution network. It's going to make your testing a bit easier. We've talked about a similar tip in some of the previous sessions on rating and routing. But if you leave those blank, the system can essentially use that freight bill type assignment record at any site and warehouse within that legal entity. Now, of course, if you have a business requirement where a certain carrier only picks up from a certain site and or warehouse within your network, then you could specify that. It just may mean that you have to create additional records in this setup if you have the same carrier and freight bill type that apply at other sites or warehouses in your network. Then for our reconciliation reasons, there is a parameter on this form outside of the debit and credit accounts that allows you to specify that you want to pay the freight vendor. And if you check that parameter, and we are going to look at it, but if you check that parameter, the system is going to go to the carrier setup and look for the freight vendor account that's specified. So you want to make sure that if you're using that parameter, that you have that corresponding setup enabled on the shipping carrier. And then finally, with the audit master, this is actually what I have a screenshot of on the right-hand side of the slide here. But our tip is to make sure that you set manageable tolerances. I know this is a bit small, but again, we'll get in the system and look at this. But if you can see from the screenshot, I have a tolerance set up for 5% under and 5% over, with an exception for a certain billing group or charge of detention where my tolerance is a little bit more narrow. But what we mean by set manageable tolerances is as it applies to your business, right, and kind of the trend for your freight reconciliation, right, how your carriers are actually billing you versus what your estimates are kind of historically. Say historically they're, at least 7% over your estimates. Then my setup here of 5% is really not manageable, right? Because if my carrier is always at least 7% over, then my auto match process is always going to kick out those records because I've only allowed a tolerance of up to 5%. So that's what we mean by set manageable tolerances. Something where, if you're going to use the automated match and pay or auto reconciliation process, really you're doing that to gain some efficiency so that you don't have all of that manual review process for every single invoice and freight bill. So you want to make sure that this audit master is capturing, a good portion of your carrier invoices, and it's only going to, kick out anything that's truly an exception that you want somebody to manually review. So make sure you're setting yourself kind of up for success there with the tolerance levels that you define. So with that, I am going to hop over to the system and I'm going to refresh, and we're going to talk through each of those configurations that I went through so that you can see the form live in the system here. So I do want to start with the transportation management parameters because I mentioned them at the beginning as kind of the first core configuration. So I have a couple of different tabs open, and let me show you where to navigate to this since I had a direct link here. We are in transportation management, and then we are in setup, and then the transportation management module parameters here at the first form. That will bring you here. And the first parameter I mentioned is just this flag down here at the bottom under freight reconciliation that just says I want to enable freight reconciliation so that I can use this feature and this functionality in TMS. And then under the vendor invoice tab here at the top, you'll see that we've got several other parameters that can be defined. I will say the first set here is regarding the vendor invoice journal name. We can define some text that shows up in the journal, the note type. We can define whether or not we want to automatically write this journal during that auto match and pay process, and whether we want to automatically post it once it's approved. And that approver can be defined over here. And this match interval is in seconds. I do have it defined at 120 seconds. That's the just minimum recommended value that should be in this field if you're using the auto match and pay process. And so if you do want to automatically match and pay, you want to also enable this parameter here that says automatically match and pay the freight invoice. If this is set to no, and you do have freight reconciliation enabled, you can still do the manual match and pay process and still submit your vendor invoices for approval. You just will not be able to run the automated match and pay batch jobs. So make sure that if you want to go fully automatic with the process, that you enable this flag as well. And I will say another tip is that even if that is your end goal and solution is to do the automatic payment, that you may want to start when you first are testing this functionality with this parameter off and test using the manual match and pay process, just to get familiar with it, to see what the system is doing in the process. And then once you're comfortable with that, go ahead and turn on the automatic match and pay, run those batch jobs, and then see how it's behaving and what types of things it's kicking out as exceptions, and kind of fine tune your audit master setup until you feel like you're at a place where that's manageable for your production scenario. So that's the transportation management parameters. So then let me go through the other setups that we have. So they are under setup, and then this freight reconciliation group has all of the other forms that we discussed. So I'm going to start with the billing group. So this is the one, again, as I said, it's a very simple setup. It's just our billing group ID and the name or the description of the group. But our tip here was to go ahead and configure these based on how your carrier is billing you. What kind of categories are showing up on your carrier invoices today. Those are the type of things that we would want to configure for the billing groups. So pretty straightforward setup form there. I'm going to go to the freight bill types next. So the freight bill types, you will probably notice one thing first off is that at the top of the form, we have got an engine assembly and an engine class. You do not need to know what these are or specify them. They are populated when you do the initialize base engine data for any new environment. And we discussed that in the previous TMS configuration session on rating and routing. So just like all of your engines are automatically populated with that information, so is this freight bill type. So this will be populated. And then down here in the detail is really where you define those matching requirements. So our tip was to make sure that you set anything as match required to yes, where you want to enforce that the freight bill and the carrier invoice have this field that you've selected populated, and it matches for your auto match and pay process. So you can see here that I do specify that the billing group has to match. I have another field that's in the form, and that's my external code that's specified on my carrier setup, but I am not saying that that has to match. So maybe I have specified an external code in the system and therefore it shows up on my freight bill, but maybe the carrier does not populate that external code on their invoice, and therefore I don't have a match, but I don't necessarily want the reconciliation process to kick that out as an exception if I can still match the two records based on the billing group. So I've left it in here, but it is not required for matching. And I'll show you here, if you create a new record, there are several other kind of predefined fields that you can add into this details section. So maybe you've got a booking number with the carrier, and you might want to specify maybe that is required for matching, because that must match on the carrier invoice to what you sent out with the booking number that they gave you. Okay, so that is the freight bill type. And so let's switch to the freight bill type assignments. So here you'll see, based on that tip, that I have left the site and warehouse blank on these setups. I am in a Kintoso environment with just the standard demo data. So feel free to follow along. You should see similar data in your environment if you've got one populated. So this form is showing you by shipping carrier which freight bill type applies. So when you receive a carrier invoice from this carrier, which freight bill type should the system use to then go determine what are the matching requirements for those different fields that we just looked at. And again, we just recommend that you leave the site and warehouse blank, so that, say, for this parcel carrier here, if I specify a site and warehouse where this parcel carrier picks up, but they also pick up at other sites or warehouses within my legal entity, then I would have to create a new record in this form with like the same assignment information, just a different site and warehouse specified. So I'm kind of, inflating the configurations in this form if I start to specify sites and warehouses, where if I leave it blank, I can just say that this parcel carrier essentially can pick up at any site and warehouse. So that's our freight bill type assignment. Let's review our configurations now for the reconciliation reasons. So this is the form where we specify the debit and credit accounts. Again, these are the accounts that will be used for the variance. So between the invoice amount and the freight bill amount. And then there are a couple of parameters to note on this form. The first one is that pay the freight vendor that I mentioned earlier. So you can see that for this approval reconciliation reason code, we have said, debit this GL account, which is a freight payable account, and we haven't specified a credit account because we've told it to pay the freight vendor. And with that checked, as I mentioned in the tip, what we want to do is that we want to make sure under our carrier and shipping carrier setup that we have actually got a vendor account specified on the carrier. So when you say pay the freight vendor, the system says, okay, I can do that, but it's going to come here on the shipping carrier setup to look for this vendor account to know which account to charge. So make sure that that is populated. And then let me go back to the reconciliation reason so we can talk about this last parameter, which is the override accounts. So you'll see that is checked for this freight bill underage reason code that is set up. And what that tells the system is to use this debit and credit account that's specified on the reason code versus charging the accounts that are specified on the miscellaneous charge that is used when the apportionment happens, when that freight bill is initially generated when we ship confirm our load. And we will talk about that when we go through the demo as well. So those are our reconciliation reasons. I will mention that those are used in both the manual reconciliation process. So even if you are going through all of the records by hand, if there's a variance and you go to submit the invoice for approval, it will ask you for a reconciliation reason code for the variance. And then also you will see in our audit master, which is our last configuration form here, that those same reason codes are defined here for our overpayment and our underpayment. We pick any of those reason codes that we have defined. And then the system, if there is a record that it can automatically match within these tolerances that we've specified, but it's not an exact match. So say it's 3.5% under or something, it falls within my tolerance, but it's not exactly what my estimate was, then the system is going to go ahead and in that case that I just mentioned for 3.5% under, it's going to use this FB underage for the underpayment reason code, and then it's going to go ahead and automatically write my vendor invoice journal, post it, submit it for approval, all of that based on those vendor invoice parameters that I set up in the transportation management module parameters that we discussed. So the other thing to point out here, again, our tip was to make sure you're setting these minimum and maximum tolerances, at a level that's manageable for your business. You can see that it percentage, it can also be an amount. So if you're working more in flat fees, you might want to work in an amount versus a percentage, but that's up to you. And then at the bottom is where we can specify any exceptions to kind of this overall tolerance level that's specified in the middle of the form here. So you can see I've got a detention accessorial charge for my carrier where I will allow 5% under. I'm always happy to pay less than my estimated charge, but I am not allowing any overage on that charge. So if my carrier charges me even a penny more than they were supposed to, then that carrier invoice is going to get kicked out of this auto match and pay process as an exception. And I'm going to have to review that manually and either approve it or not, based on the scenario. So those are all of the configurations. So I'm going to take a few minutes and go through a demo here, and then I will have time to answer any questions that have come up in the chat during the presentation. So I am going to start with a sales order that I put into the system earlier, and so I will bring that up. So I've got a sales order for my item and quantity. I have already done the warehouse management side of the process to release and pick this order. So I want to start at the point where we're going to look at the load. And I want to show you guys, we also have covered rating and routing in another session, but I just wanted to start at this point to hopefully tie this whole process together for you. So from my load, I'm going to go into the rate route workbench, and I'm going to ask the system for a rate. Down here on the results, it has told me I can ship this load with this carrier for this rate. That's my lowest cost rate because I only clicked rate and not rate shop, if you remember that from our previous Tech Talk. If I'm good with that rate, I'm going to go ahead and assign it to the load. So now I've got a record. This really is my estimated freight charge, right? I've got this $1,000 freight charge. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to close my rate route workbench to get back to my load. And it's just in a loaded status. I have not confirmed it yet, because if you remember, that is really our trigger point for a couple of things that are going to happen here. So I wanted to show you this. When I confirm the outbound shipment, it's going to tell me it's been confirmed. My load status goes to shipped. But more importantly, a couple of things have happened, right? If I go to the transportation tab under related information, I can now see my freight bill details. So if I open this up, I see that I've got that $1,000 estimated charge was actually broken into a $900 freight charge. And I've got this other freight bill line for an accessorial charge for $100. And that is for that detention billing group. So these are my estimated charges that are on my freight bill. So this is the freight bill record that I'm going to end up matching to my carrier invoice. But before I go to that process, I want to show you the other thing that happened when I confirmed the shipment, which was that estimated charge of the $1,000 was apportioned back to my sales order line. So if I close the load, that should bring me back to my original sales order. And if I go to sales order line under financials, maintain charges, I should see the same breakdown of the two fees for the freight and the accessorial as a miscellaneous charge. And as we mentioned, keep in mind, because it's kind of important with the way we have the reconciliation reason codes and the accounts set up, is that so the initial accounts that are charged for this freight estimate are based on this charges code setup that we have for freight. So we're debiting customer vendor here and crediting this order freight account. So those are the initial accounts. And then those accounts on the reconciliation reason code are what are used depending on your setup for the variance between these charges and your carrier invoice. I will also mention I'm in a pretty simple scenario here on a sales order with one line. But if you had multiple lines on your sales order, the apportionment is happening by weight. And that is based on the setup of the generic engine for apportionment in transportation management. So we did discuss rating in a previous session. I don't know that we've specifically discussed the engine for apportionment, but if you're curious, if you would like to change those parameters, it is under the transportation management setup, engines and generic engines. You can find the default engine for apportionment is right here. So it's apportioning by weight. So that's, you can see that is the unit in the parameters. So what that's going to mean in kind of a practical example, if I go back to my sales order here, if I did have 2 lines and say I had, you know, the 60 total pieces, but it was split over 2 different lines. And if it was 30 pieces and 30 pieces, then I've got a 50-50 split. And when I came into each line to see the financials maintain charges, I would only see, you know, $450 here and $50 here. So, you know, based on that split of the quantity across the lines, I'm going to see the charge apportioned in the same manner. So for the total sales order, those charges should add up to the totals on the freight bill. Okay, so hopefully everybody is with me to this point. So now what I want to do is really go through the reconciliation process, which is what we've been discussing that all of our configurations are used for here. So I'm back on my load. I'm going to go back into that freight bill that was generated. And I mentioned earlier that the carrier invoice, when you receive it, it could be imported into the system. There are data entities for the freight invoice details form. There's a header and a line level. So you can import that into the system if your carrier is capable, or you can manually enter the freight invoice from scratch. I will show you that form. But I can also use the freight bill as a starting point to kind of save myself some manual entry of some of the data points that are just related to, you know, the load, the order, and those types of things, because those will all be populated for me based on what's already on the freight bill. So in order to do that, I'm just going to start with this freight bill and then click the generate freight bill invoice. I'm going to give it an invoice number. And then you can let this run in the background if you want it. It typically doesn't take long to generate. So I'm just going to let it run here in the foreground. And so this is the freight invoice detail form. So if you were coming to this form, I will show you where it's at in transportation management. And then under inquiries and reports, you've got the freight invoice details. So same form. If you were going to do it totally from scratch, you would just create a new record, but then you would have to fill in a lot of this information. You can see that coming from the freight bill estimate, it already populated a lot of this information for me. But what I'm going to be able to do now is look at my freight invoice lines. And again, it's bringing in those 2 records from the freight bill for both the freight charge and the accessorial for detention. I can go ahead and modify this, right? Because it's just going to assume when I start with the freight bill that the charges are exactly the same as the freight bill. But if my carrier charges actually something different, then I can go ahead and put that in here. So maybe I've got 9.25 for the freight charge, and maybe my accessorial is the same. That was a just $100 flat fee, and it is not any different on the invoice. So those are my changes. You know, that's my invoice versus my estimate. And the important thing I want to do here is mark this invoice ready for automatic matching if I am going to do the automatic match and pay. That is the process I'm going to demo because I have previously demoed the full manual match and pay process, and I believe the Introduction to Transportation Management Tech Talk. So if you want to see that manual matching process end to end, please go back and review the demo in that session. But in order to show you the automatic, I'm going to go ahead and mark this invoice ready for matching. And I'm just going to save that. And I'm going to close here. I'm going to also close my freight bill. So we've got this freight bill estimate that's out here that was generated when we ship confirmed our order. These charges got apportioned back to our sales order. And now we've got that carrier invoice that we entered into the system. And now we want to go through the reconciliation process to match up those two records. So let me kind of back out of all of these forms here. And I'm going to go through, let me collapse this to clean it up a little. We're going to go through the auto match batch process first. So there are a couple of different batch jobs. They're both under the freight bills and invoices tab here in transportation management. When you open auto match batch, it may be a little confusing because it's going to have the name in the batch task description of this batch job. They are different, but just warning you in case that is a bit confusing. So when I open auto match batch, see how we have a description here and in the task description where that does not really match. If that is going to confuse you, go ahead and change the description here. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. This process is going to go through that automatic matching for the reconciliation. So it's going to look at the freight bill, look at the carrier invoice. It's going to be using those configurations that we talked about, the freight bill types and the freight bill type assignments to figure out which fields are required to be matching. Then it's going to look at the audit master and see if any variances fall within your tolerances that are defined or your exceptions. And if they do fall within, then it will use the reconciliation reasons on the audit master to go ahead and just automatically, create that vendor invoice journal. And then depending on your other vendor invoice parameter setup, it may go all the way through and approve that and post it. Or you can leave some of those parameters off and do the approval manually. But if it falls outside of the tolerances when it's looking at the audit master, then it's going to go ahead and kick it out, and you would have to do a manual match and pay process, which again, I have covered in another session and you can certainly review. I'm going to go ahead and run this auto match batch job. And let's go ahead and take a look. This should not take too long to run. I just wanted to put it in batch just to kind of point out that description was not exactly intuitive for this auto match batch job. So you can see that it has ended. It does not have anything in the log. So that was successful. And I can show you kind of what has happened with our freight invoice. So if I go to the freight invoice detail form, I should see that invoice that I had generated earlier. But instead of the previous status that we had, we now have this ready to process. And you can see that workflow status on the lines as well. So that means that it did match. You can actually see that here in the summary where it has reconciled the $25 that was over, and it matched the $1,000. And I can always look at the line reconciliation details if I want to see the reason code that was applied. But this reason code, again, is just coming from that audit master that I defined. So my $25 out of 900 falls within my 5% tolerance. So it used the reconciliation reason code I defined on the audit master, which does say to go ahead and approve the overage and pay the freight vendor. So this still has a ready to process workflow status, because there is that one other batch job that's out there, and I will show that to you. And that's the one that is going to have the name, and this time this is actually the right name for this batch job, the ready to process matches and reconciliations. So if you were going through a manual match and pay process, you could look at that match freight bills and invoices form and manually do those matches, and then still run this batch job to process them. So you can do the matching, but instead of maybe submitting all those for approval individually or manually, maybe you still want to kind of gain some efficiencies and batch everything that's been matched together for a reconciliation and approval. So I'm going to put this one in a batch task as well. I'm going to go back to the batch jobs. Again, this one should not take too long to run. And that looks like that one there has already ended. This time we should have a log that tells me how many vouchers were posted. So those AP invoice journals. So I do have 2, and that's because I had those 2 different charges. So now we can go back one more time now that we have run both batch jobs for the full auto match and pay process. I can look at the freight invoice detail again. I'm not going to have anything here because by default it hides any of the approved records, but I can uncheck that to show anything here. Let me filter for my invoice that I have to show you. So now we can see that the workflow status is actually approved. And right from this form, I can actually go to the vendor invoice journals that were posted. So it's going to show me the journal reference number, and I can get to the detail from this form as well. I can see that it was approved by that admin user that I had specified in the vendor invoice parameter setup. And I can go and look at these lines as well to see the accounting that was posted. So one other thing that I do want to point out, I'm going to back up here. There is an unmatched freight bills form. This is where any freight bill that's been generated but has not yet been matched to a carrier invoice, all of those records you will see in this form. You can see that I no longer have the ones from the load that I was just working with because they've now been matched, but I do have some older records that are hanging out here. You can, if you want to clean up these freight bill records, say you never received a carrier invoice, or you did and it didn't totally match the freight bill records, and there's some, you can see this one was a partial match, but then there's still a partial amount out here. Kind of the final step in all of this freight reconciliation process is that you can discard kind of these freight bill estimates that are hanging out here that do not match any carrier invoice. When you do that, again, just like in your manual match and pay or auto match and pay process, it's going to ask you for a reason code for why you're discarding the remaining amount. And you can see this is $90 that I'm discarding here. So maybe I just say that was an underage. And when I say okay, now it's going to get rid of that, and I'm no longer going to continue to see that unmatched freight bill out here, which just helps to keep this form clean, as well as I will show you the match freight bills and invoices form quickly here. I'm going to clear out any criteria just to bring it up. But this is the form you can show anything that's already been submitted or approved, but this is the form you would work in for the manual process. And one of the reasons we want to discard those unmatched freight bills is because this part of the form gets cluttered, right? And you might start to see some performance degradation in the auto match and pay because it's going through all the unmatched freight bill records to try to find matches to the carrier invoice. So the more that you kind of leave those things hanging out in the unmatched freight bill, the longer it can take to evaluate in that auto match batch job as well. And you can discard directly from here or that form that I just showed, which was the actual just the unmatched freight bill form. So from either place, you can discard the records that are not going to, ever have a match to a carrier invoice. All right, and that is the end of our freight reconciliation demo. So let me go back to our slide deck, and I'm going to ask Aaron, were there any questions that I can address that came up in the chat?
Yeah, there's a few. Sure. So probably the first one that I want to talk about is, I know you mentioned for getting freight bills into the system, you kind of mentioned EDI. Can you maybe talk through the different ways of either how we can import, do we support any OCR, maybe talk through any of the EDI setups that are required to get those in the system, just ways that you can somehow automate that process of getting freight bills into the system?
And so let me switch my system here. So not for the Dynamics, but for the carrier invoice, which is what your carrier is actually providing you, there's essentially 3 ways that can get into the system, right? We can import it, and let me show you, maybe I can bring up the our data management framework here. In our data entities, we should have data entities for, let's see if we've got, here are the freight invoice headers. So it looks like we've got a V2 entity here. Let me filter for freight invoice. So we've got a V2 entity for the freight invoice headers and the lines. So you would want to use those. Looks like there's even a composite entity that would contain these. But you would want to use these 2 data entities to populate that information. I would say probably, one of the most important things if you are going to use the data management framework in these entities is to make sure that on the header, when you're entering in the information, that you actually make sure that that value for the is ready for matching, which I think is this one right here, that this is checked to yes. That way, if you're going to do the auto match and pay process, this is checked and it will get picked up. Otherwise, if you leave that unchecked in your import or even through your manual entry and you run your auto match process, this carrier invoice record is not going to get picked up. So make sure that this is invoice, automatically matched, is checked anytime you're doing an import. Now, if you are not going to do that, you can do one of 2 other options. One is one that I showed, which is basically to start from your unmatched freight bill or your freight bill details and go ahead and create the carrier invoice from the freight bill. So I did that in the demo. The other thing you can do is just go directly to the freight invoice detail form here and create a new record. Right, but you can see that this is completely blank. I'm going to have to enter all the carrier invoice information from scratch. And again, even if I do this, go ahead and make sure you're checking this invoice is ready for automatic matching. But those are the 3 ways. So we've got an automated way, kind of a semi-automated way by starting with the freight bill, or I've got a completely manual way by just coming into the freight invoice details form and creating a new record. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. You said that, so that's the 3 different ways, correct? You covered all those?
Yes.
Okay, good. So then the next question that I wanted to ask you about is for the apportionment. You said, by default, you have it set up for weight on yours if there are multiple lines, let's say, on the order. There's questions around, can you do pieces or volume or things like that?
You can. I did point out, let me bring back up the system here. I did point out in the demo, if you go to the transportation management setup under engines, you would go to generic engine. That's where you're going to find the apportionment engine. This is just the default one that kind of comes with the Contoso data, right? And its parameters are to apportion by weight. So if you want to use a different unit to apportion by, you need to change the parameter here in the apportionment engine. So that's where you would do it.
Okay, next question is, do we support if the carrier invoice is in a different currency than, let's say, the product, do we support multi-currency in these scenarios?
That is a good question. I think for the currency, so let me bring up see if it's on my freight bill here. I do have currency defined. I would assume it's on my freight invoice detail as well. So if we had an exchange rate between the two currencies, we should still be able to match, but I would certainly test that. It's not something I've tested myself recently to run the auto match process and make sure that it's converting the currency on the carrier invoice to then do a match between the converted currency and the one on the freight bill estimate. So I would think it's supported. We've got the currency there. I would hate to say a definite yes without having tested it. So definitely do some testing.
Okay, I think maybe just for a final question for today, I know there's some questions around inbound, so for purchase order freight as well. Maybe just from a high level, talk about what is possible, if there's any differences from what you described as part of the sales order process that we're looking at today versus what that would look like from an inbound and purchase order process.
Yeah, so not much difference from a kind of a process flow perspective. If I go to my load planning workbench here, if I had an inbound load that I was planning, I'm still going to have kind of a trigger point here where I confirm an inbound shipment. That's still a trigger to create a freight bill. And then if you've got a carrier invoice for that inbound shipment, you can still do the reconciliation process in just the same way. In apportionment, all that it's going to be the same, only your source order is a PO and not an SO. But the other thing I will point out, and we looked at it, but I didn't specifically call it out in the freight bill type assignment, there is a direction that you can specify. So if you do have a freight bill type and carrier that maybe only is bringing you freight, so inbound freight, you can specify inbound here, or you can specify outbound if it's only a carrier that picks up and delivers for you. But again, I will kind of caution the same thing as the site in the warehouse. If you start to specify those for specific carriers and that carrier does inbound and outbound, you're better off leaving it as none, because then it will apply to both directions of movement. But you can certainly specify it here. So yes, the freight reconciliation process, I guess, a long-winded way to say, yes, it works for inbound freight as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicole. All
right. If that is it, I think we're right at time. So I'm going to throw it to Peggy, and I'm also going to bring up the slide deck one more time so I can share with you my contact information here. So feel free to reach out, connect with me if there's any questions that we weren't able to answer in today's session. Back to you, Peggy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. Great presentation today. So if the attendees could please have a look in the chat window where I've posted a link to a short survey. We'd love your feedback on today's session and hear what you'd like to see in future events. The survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. So again, we really do appreciate your participation. As a reminder, the recording of this session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. So a big thank you to Nicole and all of our Q&A moderators and our audience. Have a great day or evening wherever you are.